Mosquitoes can bring more than just a bite with them. Find out what else on Vax Matters.
So, what are mosquitoes infamous for? Aside from the bites, these insects have had notoriously been disease carriers throughout history, creating epidemics in many areas of the world. In this episode, research entomologist Jennifer Breaux joins us to talk about the disease threat of mosquitoes over the years and whether we still need to be concerned. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on our show today, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be fun.
It's our pleasure. So, okay, let's start from the very beginning. How do mosquitoes become infected with diseases and then transfer them to humans?
Great question. Mosquitoes become infected with diseases when they bite an infected individual. That pathogen then enters their body and goes through a development or growth phase inside of that mosquito. That can take anywhere from roughly 8 to 15 days for that to occur. And then they transmit it to a new host when they take their next blood meal.
I know that this episode is going to be so important to people because living in Louisiana, mosquitoes are part of our routine of moving around. It's like traffic and weather. We think
Yes.
about mosquitoes if you're doing a
Yeah.
family function outside, if you're working out, if you're doing mosquitoes are a big part of that. And a few years ago, West Nile was a big part of our dialogue as it related to mosquitoes. But outside of that, what are some other common diseases that mosquitoes carry?
So we have a global vector-borne disease burden that accounts for about 17% of all infectious diseases. And
Okay.
so that's not just mosquitoes, but also ticks and other organisms that are considered vectors, with about 700,000 deaths annually if you put them all together. Here in the United States, we have a lower vector-borne disease and mosquito-borne disease burden than in other areas of the world, mostly due to climate and vector suitability. So here in the US, we have West Nile virus absolutely being the most common of the mosquito-borne diseases. We
Mhm.
also have St. Louis encephalitis, triple E, also called Eastern equine encephalitis, and Western equine encephalitis.
Hmm.
There's another encephalitic virus that's mostly in the North and Midwest region called lacrosse encephalitis. So those are sort of the big ones here. Globally, the ones you're probably more familiar with or that most people have heard of are dengue, yellow fever, malaria, the Zika virus, which became
Right.
all over the news in
Right.
2014 with the
Right.
outbreak in Brazil,
Yeah.
and then a few others that are less common overall.
I'd never heard of the only one in there I never heard of was dengue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
hmm
Could you tell us about that one? Well, that's going to come up later up in the interview, but tell us about that. Let's jump to that.
Sure. So dengue is native to the Americas, Asia, and Africa at this point. It is transmitted primarily by Aedes aegypti, but Aedes albopictus is now a global secondary vector. So dengue is actually the most common mosquito-borne disease in the world. Half the world's population is at risk of dengue because it has a huge geographic area of occurrence. Luckily, only 1 in 20 develop severe case of dengue, which is called dengue shock syndrome or dengue hemorrhagic fever. So while severe illness is not very, very common, it definitely can kill you. It's a very painful, long, febrile illness that causes a lot of joint pain. Luckily, here in the US, we only get about 2,000 cases a year, mostly travel cases, although with increasing climate change, global warming, increased distribution of the vectors, we are starting to see locally acquired cases here in the US, particularly in southern Florida. I believe we had about 57 or 58 locally acquired cases in 2022.
And that was in Southern Florida.
Correct.
Not far from home, huh?
I know,
Not far
right?
from
I
home.
can almost
Yeah.
hear people locking their doors now.
Well, and
That's right.
and the point that Clay was making too, we know about mosquitoes. They're a part of our life, or, everything kind of revolves around that sometimes in the spring and summer, even to the fall. But you don't realize what damage they can do to the human body. Now, are there vaccines for some of these or no? Or How does that work, Jennifer?
There's been a huge push for a very long time to develop effective vaccines for all of these mosquito-borne diseases. Some we've been able to make effective vaccines for. Some we've been trying for years and years, and either the effectiveness wasn't high enough or they just couldn't quite figure out the formulation. So for dengue in particular, there has been a vaccine, I want to say since 2015 or 2016, but it was not approved for use in the United States until last year. So the name of that vaccine is Dengvaxia, and it actually has fairly good results. It's about 80% effective in preventing illness.
Wow, that's really good.
Um, it's very good.
Uh-huh.
I know previous versions and different versions of the dengue vaccine were not so effective. One sort of restriction of taking this vaccine is only available and licensed for 9 to 16-year-olds with clinical evidence of previous infection. So, unfortunately, that rules out a
Why?
whole lot of people in the US
It
from being able to take it.
Why such a
why?
constricted
Yeah.
window?
So, dengue is one of these viruses that your first infection is, can be bad, and they have statistics to describe that. But your second infection is it has the highest threat of being a severe infection, essentially. And so, what they don't want to do is give somebody the vaccine that will cause that immune response, and then if they do get infected the second time, then it's going to be a much more serious infection. So they're trying to avoid that. So it's the younger folks that are eligible for this with clinical evidence of previous infection. That way, that immune system that the vaccine will stimulate is essentially the second infection. And then in future infections, it will not be as serious. So that's the sort of the idea behind that.
What do we have to be concerned with here in Louisiana? And we were talking initially, and Clay made the point about West Nile. That was all over the news, and well, it still is, obviously. And with
Sure.
mosquito abatement and all the things that we have to do, and we're always cautioned to be aware of. You're talking about the most common in the world, the dengue. I've never heard. We've never
Right,
heard of it, and
right.
yet it's the most
Right.
common in the world, not just in the southern or the southern northern hemisphere. It's in the world.
Sure.
What do we need to be aware of? What do we need to do?
Here in
Yes,
Louisiana,
ma'am. Yes.
so here, I can tell you we have super robust mosquito control here in Louisiana for the most part. What we are monitoring for here, most districts, would be West Nile virus, St. Louis encephalitis, and Triple E, which is Eastern equine encephalitis. These are all mosquito-borne viruses that occur almost throughout the US. West Nile, in particular, entered through New York. It was first characterized in New York in 99. Of course, originates from elsewhere in the world, but quickly spread throughout the United States. And so we have issues with West Nile everywhere. Here in Louisiana, it is the one that we are the most worried about. It is the one that
Mhm.
is the most common. What's really interesting about West Nile, though, is that 80% of human cases are asymptomatic.
So you don't
Only
know
about
you have
one.
it if you
That's right. That's right. You
Oh.
have no symptoms. You don't know you have it at all. And in some cases, this is a good thing because when you get West Nile virus, you are, at least it's thought, you're immune to it for the rest of your life. So one infection is enough to prime your immune system for the rest of your life. So if you're one of the lucky ones that has asymptomatic infection, that's really wonderful. If you are one of the unlucky ones, which is about 1% of cases
Mm.
where you develop severe West Nile disease or neuroinvasive disease, NID is what they call it. It's really not a great virus to have. So the concern is not necessarily how frequent people become infected or how frequently they are severely affected by West Nile, but just how severe and deadly it can be for people who do develop severe illness.
So this has only been around, you said in New York in 1999?
That was when we first detected West Nile in the continental
Gee,
United
it's
States,
less than 25
1999.
years. It
Right.
it seemed like it's been around forever.
I
And,
know.
I mean, I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time, and that surprised me.
Mhm.
Right?
What about what Louisiana has done to deal with mosquitoes as an issue here? We've got so much water and dormant water around our state
Mhm.
and areas where these mosquitoes breed and multiply. And we've talked a lot about
Mm.
how you you prevent having them multiply around. But what has the state done to address this?
So we have our state health department, our local city health departments, and parish health departments all, I think, work together really well, work together with the CDC and other federal and national entities, our health control associations, and
Mm.
public health and environmental health. So there's a whole lot of collaboration going on to prevent the incidence of vector-borne disease in Louisiana. I think the really important thing and the message that we always try to get out is step one is prevention. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
some of these things may have medical interventions, some may have vaccines, but for us here, there's no vaccine for West Nile. So we start by educating our community, educating our public health officials. And so that's really important to make sure that people are performing source reduction, making sure they're not accidentally breeding mosquitoes in their backyards, and then just sort of being supportive and cooperating with your local abatement districts to
So
make sure you're reducing your mosquito populations and your risk of bites.
what you just
And
said,
it,
and that's the thing. It's like people don't know they're accidentally breeding them. They've
Yes.
got
Yeah.
buckets in places and they don't know, and that water is in there because it rains and you don't think about it.
Absolutely, and then you've got your flower pots,
Yep,
and you have the little lips underneath it.
that's
You've got
right.
there are all kinds of places
That's right.
where this could happen, and unintentionally, but obviously, Jennifer, this is a never-ending, ongoing educational point that you're
Hmm.
trying to make here that we always need to be aware of
Right.
because, as Clay said, where we live.
Absolutely. We're a very wet state. We have
Mhm.
water,
Right.
we have
Right.
Yeah.
heavy rains,
Yeah.
we have flooding,
Right.
especially here in New Orleans. We have flooding in the streets all the time, or your containers in your backyard. And so even the best plans that an abatement district can possibly put forward, we can't really control those populations
Right.
and the incidence of disease if someone has, for example, an above ground swimming pool in their backyard that's
Right.
not
Mhm.
circulating and is breeding mosquitoes. That can have a neighborhood level effect. That's
Mm.
just 1 yard. So we try to get that across to people. And then the other thing we always try to get across is how you can take measures for personal and home protection. In addition to the source reduction and making sure you're not a source of breeding for these mosquitoes, you can do things like make sure you're wearing mosquito repellent when you're outdoors at night, make sure you're wearing clothes that are less attractive to mosquitoes,
Oh,
make
hey,
sure
wait,
that
wait,
you're
wait. Hang on.
following all the guidance.
Hang on a second. What
Sure.
clothes are attractive to mosquitoes? I must know
So,
this.
yes, so
That's
mosquitoes
really a
have this
thing, huh?
it is. Well, it is a thing. They
Yeah.
are attracted to dark colored clothing.
Okay.
Huh.
So
All
you want to
right.
wear light colored, loose fitting clothing. Another
Okay.
thing is that mosquitoes can bite through your clothing. So if you're
Yes.
going to be outside in the afternoons doing your gardening or doing your picnic, you want to wear light colored, loose fitting clothing. You want to cover as much skin as you can. Um, that advice is very hard to follow in southern
Oh
Louisiana
gosh.
because in the
Yeah.
summer it's extremely hot.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have exposed skin because it's just intolerable to have long sleeves and pants on, then you need to look at the CDC website
Yeah.
and use EPA registered and CDC recommended repellents on
I
your
don't think I've
skin.
ever heard that
No.
they can bite through clothes.
Listen. Oh well.
I've never heard.
Absolutely.
I
No,
didn't know that.
I've had the experience, but that was by far the most fascinating answer in the history of Vax Matters. Thank you so much for that.
They absolutely
That was
will. I
awesome.
can tell you I've got a lot of experience with that personally.
Well, I've heard about like hairspray, cologne, perfume, that things like that attract or not mosquitoes. Is that true, or is that just an old wives' tale?
So there's a ton of myths and
You're
urban
right.
legends
Yeah.
surrounding what mosquitoes like.
Yeah.
Largely, most of those pieces of information are false.
Okay. Okay.
Shocker.
So what right. There is a lot of evidence suggesting that mosquitoes do sort of preferentially like certain people.
Oh.
Now, what are mosquitoes attracted to? How do they find you? They like carbon dioxide from your breath. They
Mm.
like some component of your skin chemistry. And they also go for body heat. So skin chemistry is really important, and we're all unique in that. That's largely dependent on genetics. And so scientists recently have been trying to figure out exactly what the thing is in human skin that they're most attracted to, so that they can develop more effective repellents and things
Hmm.
like that. And just last year, a paper came out that identified, I think, carboxylic acid or one of these skin components as the thing that they were really attracted to. And we all have naturally different occurring levels of that. So that's been kind of interesting to learn.
See, I knew it. I knew there was a
Wow.
reason. I knew that.
That is fascinating.
It
Because
is
because I
fascinating.
remember thinking about, when you see the commercials about a new kind of mosquito repellent,
Yeah,
and the person puts their arm in the box,
yeah,
and the
That's
mosquitoes
right.
just, flock to it, and then they do put something in, and the mosquitoes are repelled. It's just like, holy cow, with the just the unprotected arm
yeah.
and how oh gosh, it really is a
Absolutely.
it really is an interesting education that we all need to remember
Right.
and we all need to take seriously and not just say, "Oh, it's no big deal. It's where we live. It's what we do. It's part of our everyday, in the summer." But this is serious. This has,
Yep.
we're talking about West Nile. Let's talk a little bit, we've heard about yellow fever.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
exactly what is that? And we're not trying to scare anybody. We're just trying to educate folks.
That's
So
too
you
too
know
too late for that warning already.
well, that's right. Did that ship already
I
sail?
thought
But
they-
but anyhow, we just need to educate people so they know what we're talking about
yeah,
here.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowledge is prevention,
Yes.
and understanding how these disease cycles work. Certainly, we don't want to have people go into panic or fear. I lived in Brazil for 4 years,
Oh
where the
my.
incidence of
Wow.
vector-borne disease is much higher than the U.S., and so you kind of have to come to terms with living in higher risk areas or visiting higher risk areas. But how do you understand how the disease cycles work and how to protect yourself? I think that's the information people need,
Mhm.
and that should take that fear away. So, yellow fever is another mosquito-borne virus that is very common in Africa and parts of the Americas, Central and South America mostly. It's vectored by Aedes aegypti, our yellow fever mosquito. That's its common name. And so, again, yellow fever is one where severe cases are not that common. I think only about 10 to 12%. However, if you develop severe case of yellow fever, you do have a 30 to 50% chance of dying. So
Wow.
again, it's one of those where it's not common that people are severely ill from this disease, but when they are severely ill, that's where you really have to worry. So it causes about 30,000 deaths a year, but the great thing about yellow fever is that there is a highly, highly effective vaccine available for
Thank
yellow fever.
goodness.
Yeah,
Gosh.
yeah.
Okay.
What about
Yep.
Japanese encephalitis?
Japanese encephalitis, here in the US, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to that. It's not something that circulates here
Thank
locally.
goodness.
Right,
One that we can cross off the list.
right, right.
That's
Yeah.
right. So actually, this one you can sort of cross off the list for a few reasons. So it was called that because it originated in Japan or was first characterized in Japan in the late 1800s. But now at this point, it's spread through all of Asia. Which tends to be the trend with these vector-borne diseases. They emerge, and then if the vectors are available, they spread very rapidly. The great thing about the Japanese encephalitic virus is that you're very low risk if you travel to areas where it's endemic. It mostly occurs in agricultural areas, sort of out in rural areas, and also there's a vaccine available for that one as well.
Just connected to that question, is the fact that Louisiana is so lush and green and so many trees and everything here is that a bigger contributing factor to our mosquito population than say versus a Los Angeles or a state of California that may temperature wise or landscape wise be different? I don't know if that is a crazy question, but like why are some areas more prone to a larger mosquito population than others?
It's a fantastic question and with a
Well,
very
well,
complicated answer.
all right. As I sit up in my chair, there you go.
There there is a complicated answer. So, I'll take you down this rabbit hole just a little.
Let's go.
So for myself as a mosquito biologist, that's really what my training is. What you have to understand about mosquitoes and the vectors of all of these diseases is that many of them have environmental requirements that have to be met for their populations to flourish. Some of the viruses and parasites they spread also have their own environmental requirements. Habitat is absolutely key.
Mhm.
Places have to have the suitable habitat to for the biology of that vector essentially. And so what you see, and for us those of us in mosquito control, this creates a really tough challenge for control because no two places are the same. There is no cookie cutter approach to this. So you
Right,
mentioned California, somewhere where it might be a little bit drier, a
right.
little less water, maybe a little hotter in some areas or a
Mhm.
little cooler in some areas, that's absolutely going to affect not only how large your mosquito populations are, but what your species composition is in that
Huh.
area. So the different types of mosquitoes that are able to live there. So, as you can imagine, here in southern Louisiana, we have all of these swamps. We have a completely different species pool of mosquitoes than even St. Tammany Parish, which is right across the lake. What we also have, and what I would like to argue is one of the even larger problems, is very different sort of anthropogenic filters within these areas. So, here in New Orleans, for example, we have a lot of containers, tires, and people with
Mm.
lots of plants and toys and wheelbarrows and tarps in their backyards and construction sites and sort of all these things. And for us, that really is where we prioritize when we're looking for treatments because Culex quincofasciatus, our local West Nile vector, is a very opportunistic breeder that loves to breed in larger containers.
Wow.
However, in St. Tammany Parish, right across, they have a lot of septic ditches. They have, I think, 400 plus miles of septic ditches. And Culex, the same exact species that transmits West Nile around here, is notorious for loving that super rich sewage water, that really, really funky water. They love high organic matter content in their water. So they're going after the drainage ditches and the sewage ditches, and we're going after the containers here. So there's lots of different factors that influence where mosquitoes are, which species are there, and then also which diseases are going to be around as a result of that.
Thank you for
Wow.
explaining that because I don't think that I've ever heard it.
But super rich sewage
Well,
water?
That's right.
okay, well, there you have that. But my point being, when you said there's really no cookie cutter approach, and even in a relatively short
Right.
or small area, geographically, when you're talking about St. Tammany Parish, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and all that, it can be night and day. So
Absolutely.
that's really hard for you all to try to figure out and try to know, okay, this is the hot spot. That's the hot spot. This is okay. This is what we need to pay attention to. And I believe that probably just the citizens,
Right.
just those of us in these areas, not that we want to be, stupid or not
Sure.
know what we should do. It's a completely different kind of complexion
Well,
to what we have
but
here.
what's so fascinating about the information she's sharing, and that's your point is so great, Di. It's like you don't know what you don't know,
Mm-mm,
and
exactly.
and and
Yeah.
obviously, the average person doesn't think about mosquitoes as having varied species, like they're variations of them, size and what they may carry. And that's one of the reasons why this information is just so fascinating
Yeah.
for the average person. Before we go on, if someone is wondering, hey, how can I learn more, especially someone with young kids who are outside, whether they're in sports or playing out in the yard, is there a resource that you would recommend that someone engage to find out about how they can prevent and what may be in their area depending on where they are?
Absolutely. I mean, the number one resource that is a really great resource. There's lots of downloadable materials and graphs and all the information you can possibly need is on the CDC website.
Okay.
So if you go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and go straight to their mosquito-borne diseases and vector-borne diseases pages, you will find a wealth of information. The other local sort of areas where you can get really good information, find your local mosquito abatement district.
Yep.
In New Orleans, we are the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. Most parishes in Louisiana have their own mosquito abatement. If they don't, you can go to the Mosquito Control Association. So here we have the Louisiana Mosquito Control Association. LMCA.us is their website, and you can reach out to them and get pretty much anything you need through there.
Earlier you mentioned that you lived in Brazil for a while. How
Yes.
fabulous. I'm sure that was wonderful and interesting and just terrific and all the other adjectives that would go along with that. But I'm curious for those people, now that um, COVID is, well, it's still around, but not to the degree that it was, more people are
Right.
traveling. So
Mhm.
if you're prone to go, to Europe or to South America or wherever you might be going, Central America, are there certain shots? Are there certain things that we need to take into consideration depending on where we're going in relationship to this, to mosquitoes? 'Cause you don't want to have something like that impact, your travel or staying over there, students on a visa or whatever. What are your thoughts about that, Jennifer?
I wish the guidance was a little bit more clear. The CDC does have some really great websites that describe which vector-borne diseases are really circulating in that area. They even have, for diseases like malaria, a malaria by country table that
Oh,
tells you
okay.
exactly what's going on in the region you're traveling to, which even drugs that the malaria parasites might be resistant to there. So that can help you guide your choice of whether you're going to take anti-malarial prophylaxis and which type you should take based on where you're going. So the materials are out there. But I think it has to be sort of an individual choice that you make between you and your healthcare provider, and
Mm,
after looking at what the risk really is
Yeah.
based on where you're traveling. In Brazil, yellow fever, to my knowledge, is the only vector-borne disease for which they have a vaccine. I don't believe they require you to be vaccinated to enter the
okay.
country.
So you didn't have to have proof of vaccination. Are in some countries is that the case where it's
I do
especially high some
think,
vectors?
yes, there are some areas where you have to prove to the local government that you're vaccinated against
Oh,
something before
okay.
you come in, but that's very variable. And so that's you kind of have to do your research before you start traveling.
You referenced malaria and the fact that it kills about one child every 40 seconds, which is extremely jarring to know. But let's
Mhm.
talk about the serious nature of malaria.
Malaria was for a long time considered to be the most deadly of all of the mosquito-borne diseases. It is very common in Africa and parts of the Americas. What sort of complicates malaria and how common it is that Anopheles, which is a genus of mosquito, are the ones that transmit malaria, but there are lots and lots of different species of Anopheles, and there are lots and lots of different strains of the malaria parasite. And so you have these multiple transmission cycles going on simultaneously.
What about anti-malarial pills or vaccines or something that a person could do or know about, especially as Di referenced earlier, if you travel abroad regularly?
Sure. So there's currently no vaccine approved for malaria. I know several different labs and entities and universities have tried over the years. Currently, there's not one available. You can take prophylactic pills. There are various different types of anti-malarial pills. And typically, what you'll do is if you're going to an area where you know transmission rates are fairly high, and that the virus circulates at high rates, you would begin a prophylactic ahead of going there to make sure that gets in your system. You would continue throughout your time there, and then in some cases, your physician will ask you to continue taking it for 3 or 4 weeks after you return home. So, but again, there is lots of evidence that some of these malaria parasites are developing drug resistance to some of these prophylactics.
Of course.
So,
Wouldn't you know
for
it?
this,
Yeah.
I know it's a
Yeah.
never-ending battle. So, what you really should be doing if you think you might be going somewhere where malaria is a problem is look at the CDC guidelines, check out their malaria by country charts, and then obviously discuss with your medical professional before you do anything. Some of these prophylactics, although they are fairly efficacious, they do have some pretty nasty side effects sometimes.
I've got to tell you, Jennifer, I'm just a little surprised when you're talking about malaria being the most deadly of all of the mosquito-borne diseases. Why there's not more of an aggressive, um, well, trying to come up with a vaccine, something that is the efficacy is better.
Right.
I'm just surprised that there's not when you're talking about the millions that you were saying that are impacted, not
Mhm.
just in the States, worldwide. What
That's right.
why? I mean, that just is yeah.
Well, I'm not 100% sure how the sort of effort is divided among
Yeah.
these major global mosquito-borne diseases, but to my knowledge, malaria is actually one of the best funded um, research programs on the planet. There is a
Okay.
lot of resources and a
Oh,
lot of
there's effort
money and a
going
lot
into
of
it at least.
people
Right.
working on this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's not the emphasis there, and people are really working on it. It's very hard because the malaria transmission cycle is a really complicated cycle. These plasmodium parasites undergo lots of different life stages, and all of them, are in different organs inside of the body, inside of the mosquito, inside of the human body. And so I think they've just had a really hard time figuring out the right approach to do something like a vaccine. But there's a lot of smart people and a
Oh,
ton of
yes.
resources going into this.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was sort of the primary goal was to deal with malaria in the African nations.
And that's a lot of money that's
Yeah.
going into
It's a
that.
lot of money.
And as you
It's a lot
said,
of money. It's
yes,
just I
yeah.
mean, it's a super complicated disease. So I
Yeah.
think, I think we'll get there. But it's going to require a lot more research and a little more time.
And that probably wasn't a terribly fair question to ask you because, as you said, there is, and Clay mentioned, there is a lot of effort going into it. It's not like they're just saying, the scientists and the medical professionals not saying, oh, well, we're doing this, we're doing that. It's very proactive about everything,
Very
trying to
much.
do this because of the demand and what, you don't want. What was the statistic? The children, one
Yeah.
child every 40 seconds?
Yeah.
Was that what you
That's
said?
right.
I mean, that is just unheard of.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah.
Mm.
No, I think the effort is ongoing. I think
Right.
that the scientific community is aggressively
Yeah.
trying to find a solution for this because it is so deadly. But unfortunately, it's a hard one to work with.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming to an end of this episode of Vax Matters, but we cannot end without asking you about chikungunya. Because before we
Chikungunya.
started recording this episode, you dropped that little pearl. And by the way, I
That's
think
right.
you've broken the polysyllabic record for one episode
Ooh,
with
man.
all of the wow.
Good words.
But
Uh-huh.
but let's talk about chikungunya.
Yes.
And no, ladies and
Chikungunya.
gentlemen, it's not on the menu at Ruth's Chris. It's something that you should know about.
It's definitely not. So chikungunya is another mosquito-transmitted virus that is common in Asia, Africa, parts of Europe, and then most recently the Americas. It is also vectored by our container Aedes, which
Mhm.
are Albopictus and Aegypti. So it was first isolated in Tanzania in the 1950s, and the word itself is the African Makonde language, and it means bent over in pain. So not
Ah.
a great visual.
Yeah. So that
for-
gives you the rest of that story, doesn't it?
It
Clay?
really,
Yeah.
really does.
Yeah.
So yes, it causes really extreme joint pain, high fever, malaise, a lot of the same symptoms that some of the other mosquito-borne viruses cause. Thankfully, serious complications are not very common for this one. So most people just recover fine. It's not fun, but you will recover. But for the rare cases where you do have severe illness, it can cause long-term symptoms and even death, especially in
Mm.
older populations.
Something that before we close again,
Mhm.
we have not talked about heartworm, our
Oh,
dogs.
Yes.
yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Could you, and that's critical down
Yep.
here.
Yes,
So
it
could
is.
you just, before we close, could you just talk a little bit about that too?
Absolutely. Yes. It's funny. I partner with a few of the local veterinary organizations to sort of get educational campaigns out there about heartworm. A lot of people don't realize that heartworms are a mosquito-borne disease.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the United States alone, I think there are 40 or 50 different mosquito species that can vector heartworms to dogs. So there are multiple species that can do this. It's a little tiny worm that your dog can get infected when a mosquito bites them. It's extremely common. It is most common in the US in the southeast around the Gulf Coast region. And I think last time I checked, Louisiana had the highest incidence in the United
Yeah.
States.
Wow.
So it is preventable. Those little chewable
Those
or
little pills.
shots
Yep.
or there's
Mhm.
heartworm prevention is pretty much 100% effective, but you have to really stay on top of it with your veterinary care.
And that's, again, that goes back to being a responsible pet owner.
That's right.
Bottom
Sure.
line,
Which
being
is very
responsible.
important.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely.
And Jennifer, thank you. When you were talking about the mosquitoes, I guess I didn't realize there are so many varieties. I just think of a mosquito as a nasty mosquito.
Mhm.
I had no
That's right.
idea that there were so many varieties out there that can cause damage, harm to the human body, to our animals. So this has been just a very enlightening podcast. And that's what we love to do here, on Vax Matters, to explain to folks that are listening what they need to know. Now, is there anything that you can think of that we've talked about? A lot of things, Clay
yeah.
Yes.
and Jennifer, we've run kind of the gamut.
Yep.
But is there anything that kind of stands out that you would like, in the closing minutes to just make sure that the folks listening are aware of or they need to know?
Sure. I guess it's important for people to know that they don't have to be freaked out by the presence of mosquitoes. They're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. And as you mentioned, yes, there are about 3,500 species of mosquito on the
Jeez.
planet.
It's like
We've
humans
got
don't
over
stand a chance, you
They
know?
don't, they
Oh my
don't, and we have over
gosh.
200 in the
Yeah,
US and about 80 something, 85-ish in Louisiana.
yeah.
However, it's important to remember that less than 10% of all mosquito species are responsible for any sort of human or veterinary pathogen transmission.
Less than
So the
Wow.
10%.
vast
Okay.
majority
Yeah.
do not cause a problem. And so I think it's really important, and that those of us who are in the world of mosquito biology and control, we want to make sure that we get those messages out that hey,
Mhm.
we're trying to control a very small portion of them that are important for medical reasons. And so, understanding that biology, understanding the preventative measures you can take, how the community can work together with your local abatement districts and public health partners. This is all really, really important information, and it's very available if you just kind of hop online and start doing the digging.
And it's also encouraging. Thank you. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Jennifer. That sounded good.
The best.
Yeah.
Research entomologist Jennifer Breaux. So if you came into this with a lacking of knowledge on mosquitoes, you're welcome. That's what we do on Vax Matters. See you next time.